It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Nico Hines, world editor of the Daily Beasts, joins us from London. How are you?
I'm well. Good evening.
Good evening as well to Matthew Dalton, correspondent for The Wall Street Journal. How are things?
Pretty good. Thanks, Francois.
Pretty good. Okay. Pretty good. Is it pretty good for Claude Guibal, senior correspondent at French flagship public radio station France Inter?
Pretty good too.
Pretty good too. I'm wondering, Claude, did you ever bump into Kherson Gorgestani, usually of White House fame? Because I know you were covering the midterm elections before and after.
Yeah.
A lot of midterms coverage, but we didn't bump into each other.
Didn't bump into each other. Were you surprised by the result?
Thank you, Francois.
All right, so now you meet. By the way, you can listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, and other fine streaming services. Call it retribution. A Russia in retreat on the battlefield, trying to put the lights out in Ukraine. These images taken by NASA from space show what a steady diet of bombardment can do, targeting the country's power supply. The hardship comes the same week that the capital got its first snowfall of the season. Here you see Kyiv residents lining up for water in near freezing temperatures. Nearly half the city still without electricity this Friday. Still, the president putting on a brave face.
The situation with electricity remains difficult in almost all regions, but still, we are moving away from the blackouts little by little. Every hour, we restore power to more and more consumers.
It's been one of these touch and go kind of weeks. I'll begin with you, Kherson Gorgestani, and the West has been watching. There's been pledges of generators and the likes in the view of these startling images. Winter is here.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit the same in Europe, but in the US, there's really a discussion of did we not prepare enough for the winter coming in Ukraine? Because the US really focused on military aid, on aid packages. They've put a lot of money into helping Ukraine, but they maybe didn't plan enough for those very concrete measures to help with the situation in the winter. You mentioned the generators. And so now there's a growing discussion and pressure on the Biden administration, on Congress, to try to act a little bit faster to get those things to the Ukrainian people, besides just focusing on military aid, which of course is crucial. But there is a sense in Washington that maybe they didn't prepare or they didn't start early enough preparing for that specific problem for the Ukrainians.
The look, again, since a French woman just back from the US, the look at how the war in Ukraine is unfolding when you're here and when you're there.
Well, actually, I'm not sure I will answer your questions, but when I'm looking at these images, what I think is that we are at a turning point where the Russians are pushing to negotiate. What they are actually doing in bombing civilian sites, energy supply, water system, as a simple name, it's war crime. You know, according to the international law, the name is war crimes because they are meant to hurt the civilians in order to push them either to surrender or either to force them to leave. And actually, that's what the Russians are doing. The Russian proxies these days are in the United States or here in Europe are, playing this music, this tune to say, the Western allies of Ukraine should stop their support because Ukraine is being destroyed, population is suffering so much, and
Is it working? Are there more and more French voices calling for the negotiations?
There are voices in the United States. There are voices in Europe as well. And the thing is, what the Russians are trying to do is to gain time, to win time, because with ceasefires, with whatever, because first, it will help them to restructure their forces. And also, the more time they gain, the more divided their allies will be. So it's a very dangerous trick. And now that the winter is coming, we are entering a very crucial phase of this war.
Right, buying themselves times. Nico Hines, I know the Daily Beast interviewed the UK defense minister. He's saying that the Ukrainians should press their advantage despite the cold.
Yeah, this is one of the really fascinating parts of the current kind of impasse that we're at here. There are some countries who seem very much to be calling on Ukraine to keep pushing, keep fighting, keep that counterattack going. And I think Britain is at the forefront of that. And as you say, we had an exclusive interview this week, which the minister was saying, attack, attack, attack. Now's the time to really put Putin under pressure. And yet there's also a kind of movement growing in the US, and I think the midterms were a big part of this, and where people are saying, hold on a minute, we're not going to pay for this war to go on forever. We need some sort of pathway to a solution. We need an off-ramp of some kind. And so there is some pressure for the Ukrainians to talk about negotiating or to try and find some kind of deal. But of course, there's no way that Zelensky is going to give up huge swathes of land. And so what we're seeing is a huge test of wills, and I think that will change around the world. But until it comes to a moment where the US is actually threatening to pull funding from Ukraine, I can't see the Ukrainians giving up and acceding to these wishes. There was a poll recently, as the kind of winter comes, as these power strikes have people in blackout, as the water's switched off, people are in a really awful time. You know, this is the worst time of these people's lives by far. And there was a poll that said people were willing to hunker down for another 2 or 3 years without electricity if it meant winning this war. And I think that stubbornness, that strength of will in Ukraine is something that the US completely missed and Putin completely missed. And the Ukrainians are not about to give up.
Ukraine's not about to give up. Matthew Dalton, just a word on this, because we saw those recent midterm elections where the isolationists didn't do well at all. In fact, Biden's hand might even be strengthened if he's up for backing what the French prime minister in Berlin said this Friday, which is standing by Ukraine until the end of the conflict.
Yeah, I think the political support remains very strong across the West for supporting Ukraine. I think the midterm elections really solidified that, because a lot of the candidates that were more to the very far right Republican candidates who were in the Trump camp of the Republican Party, many of those candidates lost. The candidates that are kind of traditional Republicans that have shown very strong support for Ukraine, along with the Democrats and the Biden administration, their hand was strengthened. So the political coalition in the United States is very strong behind supporting Ukraine, remains quite strong in Europe, Macron, the UK, Germany. So politically things are looking good. And I think that Russia's strategy of brutally attacking civilian infrastructure, war crimes essentially, is only solidifying support politically for Ukraine. I mean, people are really horrified, but even more by what Russia is doing right now.
Yeah, the retribution felt more specifically if you're in, for instance, the newly retaken southern city of Kherson. You can hear it in the distance, the sound of Russian shells landing. Just this Friday, authorities there talking of 15 killed, and they wonder if Moscow intends to turn Kherson into another Mariupol. In other words, to flatten the city.
4 bombs fell right next to our house. It's too dangerous for my daughter. I'm taking her to safety in Poland. Afterwards, we might not be able to evacuate.
You heard Nico Hines there, Kedevan Gorgistani, talk about the resolve of the Ukrainians, and each time there's shelling, each time they get more angry. On the other hand, there is this question of do you stay or do you evacuate? And you heard that man say it's a difficult decision, but he has to put his daughter out of harm's way.
I think there is a sort of natural, of course, reaction to want to put your especially families with young children, to put your family away from harm. But I think that, as you said, a lot of countries around the world, starting with the Russians, did not expect this type of I will stay in my country and defend it the way I can, not necessarily going to fight, but showing support for the nation by staying. And a lot of people have maybe gone, taken their family and come back. There were a lot of these types of people who stayed in Kyiv, people who moved to Lviv, but stayed in Ukraine to try to come back as soon as possible to keep this country alive, basically. And this resolve also helps with the support from the outside world, because they see that these people are not giving up. And I think it's harder politically to give up on someone who is willing to stay hunkered down, as he was saying, for months or even years in order to defend their country.
Well, let's look at the messaging out of the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin had mostly gone quiet since that retreat from Kherson, leaving it up to his underlings to bear bad news. But he waded back into it in a very public manner this Friday. He welcomed a carefully selected sample of mothers of soldiers ahead of the Russian calendar's Mother's Day, the president expressing empathy and also warning his audience not to believe everything they hear.
It's clear that life is more complicated and more varied than what they show on TV or even on the internet. You can't trust anything you see there. There is a load of fakes, deception and lies. There is lots of information attacks, because in the modern world, it's been always that way. But with modern technologies, it has become especially relevant and effective. Information is always a weapon, and the information attacks are an effective way of fighting.
You hear that, Nico? Don't believe everything you see on television. Nico Hines?
He's having trouble getting hold of Paris. This is just the satellite off air.
All right, he can't hear us now, but we'll try to reconnect there with Nico in a moment. Claude Guibal, your reaction to those words by the Russian president?
It's surreal. No, but it's interesting the way Vladimir Putin is slowly changing his public approach to this war, showing empathy. I mean, empathy is not really a word that you relate to Vladimir Putin. Actually, Vladimir Putin is not in a very good position, as Russia is not progressing on the military side, and it's because of that we are actually assisting to this massive bombing, because they cannot claim any victory. Now he's pushing towards negotiations, but what will he negotiate on? The Ukrainians won't give up anything, and Vladimir Putin, I don't think he will even consider keeping Crimea. You know, he won't consider statu quo, and his aides and also all his allies are, pushing him to keep denazifying Ukraine and to get rid of Zelensky, but he has no choice now. My question is, we are very often considering the fact that they are launching a lot of missiles, ballistic and cruise missile, and we are thinking that they don't have any more.
And they seem to have more
But they seem to have more.
Because those cost millions, those kinds of bombing campaigns.
Yeah, so this is, the question.
How long can that last?
How long can that last? Because now Russia is using more and more slow-moving, low-flying drones acquired from Iran, but also this has a limit. So this is my questions. It's about ammunition, missile, as Ukraine is getting more and more air defense system from its Western allies.
Yeah, and whether or not, and that question very briefly on this point, Matthew Dalton, does Volodymyr Zelensky go after Crimea?
Well, first he's got to, push the lines back from Kherson. There's that's sort of a question that doesn't immediately present itself. There's a lot of military intervention, a lot of work militarily that needs to happen before that can be considered. I think if he does go after Crimea, at that point you might hear voices in Europe, maybe even the United States, start to speak up and say, look, maybe now is the time that you pull back, and maybe now is the time for negotiations, because that goes back to the pre-2014 lines. It's unclear what, of course, the invasion of this February has changed everything. The terrible things that Russia has done in Ukraine might change those kind of lines in terms of where the United States and Europe might be willing to support the Ukrainians in terms of recapturing Crimea. The other risk is, Crimea is kind of like the crown jewel in Ukraine for Russia, and if Ukraine is really threatening to take back Crimea, that could provoke a much harsher response, potentially a tactical nuclear response from Russia. That's something that the United States and Europe will need to consider.
All right, and while Russia goes all out to salvage what it can in Ukraine, it's siding with the United States in urging Turkey to show restraint in Syria. That's because Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who, by the way, is up for re-election next June, has started a bombing campaign across the border against Kurdish militants there. He's told Parliament he's open to the idea of a ground invasion. This while for very different reasons. There's a protest movement on inside Iran. Both Ankara and Tehran are targeting Iraqi Kurds from different sides. Kedevan Gorgistani, what's the role of NATO in all of this? After all, you have U.S. special forces alongside those Kurds in Syria.
Well, you saw the State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, who actually put out a statement about that, not directly speaking to Turkey, but urging for restraints and not to attack the sort of global coalition against ISIS. So it was a thinly veiled sort of message to Turkey, but this is one of those examples of how do NATO members deal with Turkey, who is one of their partners, but at the same time, in some of these issues, sort of goes against maybe the coalition. And so you're seeing, at least on the U.S. side, a sort of treading carefully to ask Turkey to sort of tone it down without going all out and criticizing a NATO ally.
Nico Heinz, at this point in time, does Recep Tayyip Erdogan have a green light to do what he feels like doing?
Well, I think the US have proven over the last few years that they're not going to stick their necks out to protect the Kurds. And so in that sense, he's got carte blanche to do what he wants. Trump, pulled out of the area and allowed the Turks to rush over the border into Syria. And there's been fighting in Iraq as well. The US and the global coalition against ISIS has been entirely reliant on some of these Kurdish fighters. The SDF are now in charge of the ISIS camps where some of these prisoners are being kept, and they're saying that if the fighting comes over the border again, they won't be able to keep these ISIS fighters in custody. And so there's a huge, huge risk here. And I don't think, especially, I guess, if you put it in the context of what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia as well, you can't see Biden being willing to take a big risk in order to protect the Kurds any more than Donald Trump did when he completely abandoned them.
Yeah, and again, the Kurds getting it from both sides. You're about to see and hear Tehran's divide and rule strategy, which continues to grow more and more ruthless, both with those cross-border missile strikes against the Kurds in northern Iraq and also inside of Iran. These social media images verified by human rights groups is coming out of the Iranian Kurdish city of Javanrud. And what we have seen is this tactic, which is not just directed against the Kurds, against other minorities inside of Iran, in the face of this unprecedented protest movement that the regime is facing, saying it's foreign forces, outside forces, and targeting the Baluchis, targeting minority Arabs, and targeting, of course, the Kurds.
Targeting the Kurds because for the Iranian regime, everything can be done in order to crush the protest movement that has risen after the death of Mahsa Amini. The thing is that in Iraq, the Iranian Kurdish fighters, who are actually in the mountainsides of Iran, are facing pressures both from the Iranian side and also from their Kurdish fellows in Iraq, because the Kurds in Iraq are experiencing much more power than any Kurds in Syria, in Turkey, in Iran. They are ruling a region, and a semi-autonomous region. They have a lot of power, and they are also walking a tightrope between this Kurdish solidarity and also
keeping relations good with Baghdad.
And also with this powerful neighbor, Iran. So once again, the Kurdish fighters are quite alone, and nobody cares.
And nobody cares. We're seeing that nonetheless, the defiance continues. First off, question for you. Are you surprised that, because Iranians we've had on this set have said they themselves have been surprised at how what began with that slogan, Women, Life, Freedom, has become more than just a groundswell?
I'm surprised. I'm amazed. I would say. What I think is that the people who are actually demonstrating in the streets of Iran are the children of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are those. They were not born during the Shah, era. So they know the system by heart. They know what they are facing when they are in the street. They know they better face death than keeping. And they also know that the regime cannot put a pasdaran on everybody's back. So they are pushing. I don't know until when they can, to which extent it will last, and the regime is so strong. I mean,
we all think it's going to fade out, and it doesn't. In case it
doesn't, but also the regime will not fall, until one of the security forces
disavow
the regime.
The regime. And we're seeing incredible acts of defiance, people who are outspoken. One example, the former national team player, Voria Ghafouri, he's been arrested. The 35-year-old Kurd was a surprise scratch for Iran's World Cup squad. He's not been afraid to call out the regime on an Instagram account. To his Instagram account, he's got 3.4 million followers. He's accused of peddling anti-state propaganda. It's incredibly brave on his part, and it gives us a bit of an insight, Matthew Dalton, as to why we saw so many Iranians disavow their national football team at the World Cup, cheering even for England when they lost 6-2 in their in their opening match in Qatar.
Yeah, it was a remarkable moment, and the question is, I mean, how representative are the fans who make it to the World Cup from Iran?
This is our Tehran correspondent saying that he heard people cheering for England while watching the game on television. This is in the Iranian capital.
Well, that's amazing. I guess this sort of raises questions about really how broad and how enduring, and when I say raises questions, I mean suggests that it is, a movement that is spreading throughout Iranian society. It's something that, as you mentioned, when you see this uprising, you kind of wonder how long it can really last. It seems to kind of something that happens every 5-10 years in Iran, and then it fades away. This one, that doesn't seem to be happening yet, and you see what's happening with the crackdown in the Kurdish territory, and how brutal that has been, and really something that I don't think we've really seen in a long time. Just the scale and the violence associated with it. arguably the regime is becoming more and more concerned about it.
And we saw as well the national team, which is sort of caught between two places. Before their opener against England, they decided to stay silent during the national anthem. This time against Wales, they mumbled the words, it seems. They won 2-0. And as you just heard Matthew say, there were fans inside the stadium displaying their solidarity with compatriots back home. Your reaction to that, Nico Hines?
Yeah, I think it was very interesting. I think the arrest of the player who was left behind is no coincidence here. So we had the Iran team on the global stage refusing to sing the national anthem, whilst a crowd full of quite a lot of Iranians, it was quite a big Iranian heavy crowd for that England match, were actually booing their own national anthem. And then within days, we have this other player who's been an outspoken critic being arrested back home. And now, before today's match, you see the Iranians, they did sing along, so technically they can't be accused of having broken the rule, because apparently it went down very badly with the regime back home, that they hadn't sung on the first one. They were technically singing, but you certainly didn't see them singing with passion. When you watch the Welsh, by comparison, belting out their tune, it didn't do them very well in the end, but they gave it their all, and it was a stark contrast to the Iranians, who were kind of mumbling through the words so as to technically not be in breach of any of the rules. And I think it just shows the enormous, ridiculous pressure that is on these individuals who are being forced to represent their nation when half the nation wants them to do one thing, half the nation wants them to do something else, and their bosses in the regime and their bosses in the football team are all telling them to do different things. I think they put on a fantastic performance on the pitch, which is all you can really expect them to do. But I think that their bravery in that first game has gone noticed in Tehran, and I think they should be saluted for that.
All right, it's dividing Iranians whether or not they should even have shown up. Qatar 2022 is by no means the first World Cup or Olympics that's courted controversy. Usually, it kind of all dissipates with the opening whistle. Not this time. Here you see Germany's players putting their hands over their mouths to protest FIFA's ban on the One Love rainbow-colored armband in solidarity with LGBT rights. Kedevan Gorgistani, are you surprised? You were with us at the outset of the World Cup. Are you surprised we're still talking about the controversy? We're what, nearly a week in now?
I'm surprised if you look at the past, because as you said, usually it sort of dissipates. But when we were discussing that before the opening of the World Cup, we also said that there's something new these days, something different, and players are expected and feel that they want to speak out. They don't want to shut up and dribble, as the saying goes for basketball. And they really have shown that there are some things that they care about. It is, of course, very European-centric, very Western with the Americans, but they felt that they should speak out in their own ways, however they do it. The Americans put on rainbow colors on their crest at their training grounds, not on the pitch. The Germans did what we saw by really trying to keep it in the conversation, is what basically they're doing, working around FIFA's threat to maybe give them yellow cards if they wore that armband. And actually, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who is traveling in Qatar, came out and said and criticized FIFA and said FIFA should not be threatening those players, and players on the pitch should not have to choose between these values that they're trying to protect and having the right to play on the pitch and to represent their country.
Claude Guibal, tell me if I'm right in characterizing the coverage here in France. It's human rights, human rights, human rights, and then it's match day for les Bleus, in which case we talk football.
We are French. Sorry. Paradoxal. Yeah, but what also fascinates me in this World Cup, I think it's the most political World Cup we've ever seen, is also something we're not mentioning. It's this kind of bromance we have between the Qatar and the Arabs. Again, Qatar was so isolated for years and years and years. And if you look 2 years back, who could have believed the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman would attend a soccer match.
Or that the Qataris would be cheering when Saudi Arabia upset Argentina.
Absolutely. And I think that what is happening during this World Cup is also very interesting concerning diplomacy in the Gulf area, because this World Cup is a kind of stage where we are assisting the reconciliation of the Arabs threatened by Iran, by the power of Iran. And you can see the Arabs as, encouraging and standing with the Qatari when the Western countries are criticizing Qatar. You have President Sisi of Egypt backing the Qatar. I think that's it's a U-turn.
Why is that happening?
Maybe because Qatar first understood that Mohammed bin Salman is back in the business. Joe Biden came to remember this very humiliating visit in June when President Biden went to Jeddah begging Saudi Arabia to right the production of oil in order to lower the prices, in order to save the elections. And it was very humiliating. But anyway, Mohammed bin Salman is back in the business now, and Qatar knows that. And also, the Arabs know that it's not a very good thing to let Qatar go on the Iranian side. So they have to say, to reach out and say, okay, come back where you belong. And Qatar is in this very fragile position, Its wealth comes from offshore sites, very vulnerable, close to Iran, and it has to choose its allies.
Before we close this World Cup chapter, you've seen them at cricket test matches, rugby Six Nation encounters, and yes, even at the World Cup in Qatar, England fans dressed as, I don't know if it's Knights of the Round Table or Crusaders. Organizers in Qatar, they're opting for Crusaders. FIFA backs the turning away of those fans with a statement that reads, quote, "Crusader costumes in the Arab context can be offensive against Muslims. This is why I'm reading this to you, Nico Hines. Anti-discrimination colleagues asked fans to wear things inside out or change dress." Your religion when it comes to Crusader costumes?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding here, cross-community misunderstanding. Basically, the England fans, and look, I've travelled to a lot of England away matches, and I've seen the absolutely appalling, despicable, racist, offensive things that they've said. So don't believe that I'm trying to defend the England fans here. I'm not. I'm trying to just explain that there's been a bit of a misunderstanding here. What the England fans are doing is dressing up as St George, who is the patron saint of Britain, and the St George's cross is our flag, the red cross on the white background. He's famous in this country for slaying a dragon. And that is what these fans are celebrating. It might be true that there are one or two who understood that there's thousands of years of history and that there is a kind of cross-cultural war that these outfits harken back to. But I genuinely don't think that that's why people are wearing them. So I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding. However, it's certainly true that England fans do not go out of their way to be understanding. They're the opposite of the Japanese fans who leave the changing rooms clean, the stadium clean when they leave it. The England fans like to go over there and make a big mess. Perhaps we should be thankful for the Qatari U-turn on alcohol, because it's meant that there hasn't been any big rowdy clashes. The England fans have been pretty well behaved, even when they were being turned away with their plastic swords and shields. They didn't really put up much of a fight. So I suppose that's something to be pleased about.
Okay. Chinese fans, by the way, watching the World Cup must be wondering, how come everyone gets to go to the game without a mask? Promises to ease the country's zero COVID policy have proven empty so far. Thus, we can show you some startling images of furious Foxconn employees taking on riot police in hazmat suits over unpaid bonuses. The final straw at the world's flagship iPhone factory. workers had been locked in due to a COVID outbreak there. We've also had news in the last days of mass resignations at that factory. It's more than just about one factory, though. Here you see just some of the places where there have been COVID lockdowns recently. Currently, 6 million residents of Shenzhou under lockdown. Matthew Dalton, what was your reaction when you saw these images from of violent industrial action that you associate more with this country than with China?
Well, my first reaction was that's why my wife can't buy the new iPhone for Christmas. It's sold out everywhere. My second
Production
reaction
is
was
down 30%, by the way.
My second reaction was, I'm just thinking back to towards the beginning of the pandemic, the first year of the pandemic, when people thought that China had the kind of key for dealing with the pandemic. There were no cases. They were this China's sort of authoritarian government was thought to be, the best place to deal with this, and the messy democratic systems in the West were really struggling to stop the spread of infections. Now you're seeing infections reaching a new high. The zero COVID policy has been a complete failure, has been, crippling the economy, sowing unrest.
And yet they're doubling down on it.
They're doubling down, and this is one of the issues that you have in a undemocratic system. Was that it's just that once you have a policy, it's difficult to change course. The government is impervious in many ways to pressure from its own citizens. Despite these protests, it feels like our policy is correct. We're not going to change, and that's something that the U.S. and Europe and other democracies, despite the problems they have faced dealing with COVID, now to a large extent the pandemic for us is in the rear view mirror. We have very effective vaccines. We're highly vaccinated. The Chinese have refused to take Western vaccines. They've been relying on their own vaccines that are less effective. So you put all these things together, and it just shows that China's response, once thought to be the gold standard, is now looking incredibly foolish and harmful.
Claude Guibal?
Yeah, I think what is happening now in China is actually as you said, the Chinese vaccine has proven to be not as efficient as the other vaccines, and China is actually breaking a kind of social contract because a lot of persons now are not well protected, and the healthcare system cannot afford it. So they have no other choice than keeping their zero COVID policy the way it was. But as you said, the Chinese are just fed up with so many lockdowns. They're just watching Qatar stadium full of people and just, enjoying life they have not experienced for 3 years. And also what the Chinese government is now realizing is that the multinational companies have also changed their point of view. They have learned the lesson from the pandemic, and your wife may have a new iPhone for next Christmas, because now a lot of companies are considering investing in other places, and now iPhone are being fabricated in India because nobody wants to put his eggs in the same basket as they used to do before with China. And maybe that what we are seeing now is in China is a new phase of globalization, because now we are also at a turning point, and China cannot be the center of the world, of the industrial world anymore.
Can't be the center, can't be the world's factory anymore. You mentioned the consequences for business with no end in sight. The French embassy in Beijing taking the unusual step of going on the social media Weibo, reposting a statement by the Franco-Chinese Chamber of Commerce bemoaning, in diplomatic language, the hardships and lost business of COVID travel restrictions. Hours after that was posted, the message had been liked more than 85,000 times with an overwhelming number of comments backing France. Thank you for France for speaking in the name of the Chinese, wrote one Weibo user. It's really the country of revolution, opines another. Kedevan Gorgistani. These Weibo users, who, by the way, say they now support France at the World Cup, it's interesting. Why? Because you have, on the one hand, France saying, hey, our nationals who are working in your country, they can't get anything done. They're locked down all the time. It's kind of the opposite message of what we're hearing from Washington, which is faced with China, cut all ties, basically. I'm exaggerating, but reduce certainly the amount of business that you do.
Yeah, and I think to your point, there's a new sort of phase of globalization, and the Americans are going the extreme way because there are other political interests and ideas, because there is this rivalry, this competition, and that was the policy of Joe Biden coming into the White House, that they want to sort of get everybody on their side against China. And of course, the French are treading a little bit more lightly. They want sane competition. They want loyal competition, but they're more dependent a little bit on the Chinese. And I think the example of what's happening with these lockdowns and this COVID issue is sort of bringing to light the dependency, the ties, all of that is coming to the forefront, whereas before it was the same thing. We just didn't pay attention, and the consequences were not that big.
What Nico Hines says post-Brexit global Britain?
Well, we're still counting the dead from COVID. I think, this question about deaths versus economic prosperity is a very interesting one, and it's one that was debated at the outset of this pandemic. And I think if you'd said to people back in the glory days of January 2020, when we weren't locked anywhere, if you'd said to people, one country is going to let the virus rip, and this is going to kill 1 million of its citizens, another country is going to have careful lockdowns, and there are only going to be 5,000 people who died, I'm not sure that everyone would be saying that the US, who allowed 1 million people to die, was exactly the brilliant way that we should handle this pandemic. I think we might be being a little bit hasty in writing off China's approach to this. Perhaps when we look back at this in 10, 20 years' time, people might be saying, wow, China did a fantastic job. They're one of the only countries in the world who managed to curb huge deaths. I mean, it's easy to look at these numbers as just, numbers on a page, but that's 1 million funerals, 1 million families who lost a loved one. I mean, yeah, it's annoying to be locked in, and I get why these people are frustrated, and I get why they're annoyed, but maybe Beijing have actually done a pretty good job on this one.
Matthew Don?
Well, you have to also believe the figure of 5,000 deaths or however many.
Because these major lockdowns, by the way, are based on 31. They had a record 31,000 daily cases,
which is not that much. I mean, adjusting for size and all that. It's
in a nation of 1.4 billion.
Right, it's a very small number of cases. But I think the question, the vaccine question, is key. China's not done a good job of vaccinating its citizens, and even with the vaccine, there is some protection from the vaccines that they have given to citizens. If you're going to impose these very harsh lockdowns anyway, in addition to, vaccinating people, what's the point of the vaccine? And the question is, what is the what is the end point of this policy? It will. There's no sign that it will ever end.
So what is the president of the European Council, Charles Michel? He's going to Beijing on December 1st. What does he say to Xi Jinping?
Well, I don't know. What can he say? I mean, first of all, Xi Jinping is not really going to listen to anything that Charles Michel says to him. I think the one message that I think might get through is the fact that European companies, American companies, non-Chinese companies, generally speaking, as we've been talking about, are really reevaluating whether they can possibly remain in China and how to do anything they can to produce elsewhere. That includes bringing production back to Europe, back to the U.S., something that European and American leaders would be very happy about. And then, in the U.S., there's just this very strong political opposition in Washington for other reasons against China that is not really present in Europe nearly as strongly. So there are all kinds of forces that are coming together to decouple the West from China. And Charles Michel can probably deliver the message that many European companies are trying to get out of China, and that would not be good for the Chinese economy.
All right, we'll see whether the business argument wins the day when it comes to this issue. Many thanks, Matthew Dalton. I want to thank Claude Guibal, Kedevan Gorjestani, Nico Hines in London. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.